All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome Mathilde to the program. Mathilde Chevallier is based in Oklahoma. She is an independent scholar and has been working with our group for a couple of years now. And if you've attended any of our study groups, you know that Mathilde is sort of one of our real leaders in terms of analyzing the various sort of Lacanian and Marxist and other texts that we study. Um, One of the objectives, or sort of, I don't know, how do we say this? Like one of the big uh, contributions that Emancipations has tried to make to contemporary Marxist practice and to contemporary Marxist study is, of course, bringing out the work of the later Lukács. And in Lukács's Destruction of Reason, which for comrades that haven't seen our symposium that we held on the destruction of reason, which will actually be sort of converted into a series of essays with historical materialism soon. Check it out on the YouTube page. You must do so. One of the concepts that emerges in the kind of historical analysis that Lukács brings to bear on German idealism is the concept of the Weltanschauung, or worldview. And this has led me in my own work, and I think for Mathilde and for others, to sort of ask the question, what was the Weltanschauung in a certain way? Because there have been scientific discourses like psychoanalysis, like structuralism, that have sort of erased or maybe supplanted the concept of the Weltanschauung. But in the 19th century, worldview studies, or the concept of the worldview in post-Kantian thought, was extremely important. Many philosophers like Wilhelm Dilthey put the concept of worldview at the very center of their thought, in fact. And then it kind of disappears. And one of the ways that we wanted to get into this kind of conversation is to sort of start off with a definition or a series of conflicting definitions on the meaning of Weltanschauung, but also to ask, I think, the overall question of, is there something like a necessity for Marxist thought and the practice of Marxism in general to take seriously this concept of Weltanschauung? Or should we actually relegate the concept to the dustbin of philosophical history as a mere sort of relic of the 19th century? Some of us have argued for something like worldview Marxism, because once you introduce the concept of Weltanschauung, you have to kind of realize that there's also questions of like ideology, of class ideology. There's questions of metaphysics, of reason, irrationalism, intuition, and so on, that get thrown into the mix. So that, with that little opening proviso, Mathilde, I want to introduce your work. You can say perhaps a few things about your research, but then I want you to sort of say a few things about how you come at the problem of the Weltanschauung and why the concept interests you as well.
Sure. Um, Thank you for the introduction and those remarks getting us started. Um, I think what initially got me interested in the question was in the destruction of reason, in the section on vitalism. There's this idea of the substitution of myths for history. And, like, I feel like historical consciousness is pretty weak. And I do see tendencies to substitute, these like pseudo historical myths for history. But also the idea of modern anxiety and the idea of disorientation, I think gives rise to this need or desire for worldviews. And I think that's one of the compelling parts of Lukács is his kind of historicizing the idea by saying that, like, there was a period of like stabilization of the capitalist mode of production after, it transitioned from feudalism to the capitalist mode of production. And there's basically like, political victory. There's like kind of a latency period where things seem to be harmonizing, like in society. And then by the turn of like the 1870s, I guess, there's the concentration of and like monopoly of capital, and there's like growing anxiety, I think, among the different like classes in society. And I guess not to get too carried away, but just this general idea that like the world is shifting under people's feet, and that that whatever had accounted for the world prior was becoming insufficient. And this idea of what to do in that situation, I think, gives rise to worldview. And then on the other hand, there's just the idea that the emergence of socialism as like a working class movement within society also drove the need for a worldview as well. So it's interesting to think about like these factors for producing this need for total conceptions of a society. Why maybe there's a resistance toward worldviews prior to a certain period, like why philosophy kind of restrained itself from the production of worldviews, and then why it needed to stimulate again the production of worldviews. I think is Lukács, does a pretty good job to delineate that problem. And he says that like socialism doesn't restrain itself from having a worldview. It almost like is in itself a worldview social movement or a worldview philosophy.
Right.
And so it provides this powerful conception and orientation towards the world and its questions. And it required maybe a contending worldview to lure intellectuals away from it, basically.
Right. No, that's really well said. And I feel like there's a question about the nature of capitalist society and the forces that are deleterious and destructive in the very sort of embedded structure of surplus value extraction, and in the sort of flow of the commodification of consumer life and the kind of day-to-day experience of capitalism, where you have a situation emerge in which there's a class force that introduces the bourgeoisie into history. And of course, that introduction of the bourgeoisie as a historical agent emerges out of a series of universal emancipatory promises that capitalism self-undermines, and the bourgeoisie begins to forget the universal emancipatory basis of its own Weltanschauung. And in that forgetting, they replace it, like you said, with new myths that seek to justify the persistence of their domination, which they disavow as domination, right? So you have in capitalist society the bourgeoisie becoming this weird parasitical, almost like quasi-abusive class that doesn't acknowledge its own origins. And like if you take another Marxist philosopher who writes about the concept of Weltanschauung, Mikhail Lifshitz, he notes that when you see in 1848 the worker rebellion, a lot of new thinking amongst German philosophers, but also French and English, say, for example, with Jacob Burckhardt, who's a huge influence on Nietzsche, you see the emergence of a denial of certain forms of bourgeois expression that originated the bourgeois worldview. But the basis of Burckhardt's denial of this sort of like I don't know, like the universal liberal element of the bourgeois cultural worldview is on the basis of the class struggle. Like, for example, Lifshitz will say that Burckhardt says, I refuse to bring children into the world because I don't want the proletarian to pollute their education. And what that signifies is that the class struggle, right? Because there's a big debate, I think, in contemporary class analysis about whether Marxism maintains a two-class theory. Ultimately, it's kind of bourgeois versus proletariat. And in a way, that is what Marxism maintains, I would contend. But the basis by which we maintain that view is the basis by which the proletariat was seen as a rising class, which was coming into a kind of existential conflict and struggle with a kind of deteriorating and fragmented bourgeois class. And so it is out of the struggle with the proletariat that bourgeoisie invents like alternate irrationalist worldviews. And one of the hallmarks of the irrationalist worldview comes out of Neo-Kantianism. And we can kind of elaborate some of the main thinkers of this Neo-Kantian current. Many of them are not as well known to us today. But suffice it to say, one of the kind of core propositions that they put forward are things such as history is fundamentally unknowable from a subjective standpoint. And this actually, in a technical sense, and we can say a bit about this in a technical way, emerging really in Kant's third critique, is very interesting, because one of the claims that goes on in Kant's third critique of judgment is the idea that, and Kant never formally defines the Weltanschauung, he sort of implants the idea of it. He implants the idea that in his overarching kind of cosmopolitan vision of social life and politics, that each community comes to know the truth of its overarching culture or of its way of life through sensible intuition. But there's a kind of limit to the full knowledge of the object of the world, the famous Kantian thing in itself, or the famous Kantian noumenal. And if you've read Destruction of Reason by Lukács, you'll know that this proposal of the noumenal is very interesting, insofar as you could think of it almost like a seed that is planted into Western philosophy that kind of gives birth to a bunch of monsters, is one way to think about it. Like, what's the Goya painting of the sleep of reason produces monsters? That's kind of what's going on here. In what sense? Well, in the sense, I suppose, that what Lukács wants to maintain, and I want your thoughts on this, Mathilde, is something like the idea that every community, in order for its own self-emancipation, actually needs to go beyond the Kantian idea that its own worldview is fundamentally unknowable. And then the question becomes kind of Kant versus Hegel in a certain way. Yeah. And of course, we should say, and I'll stop here, that Hegel says very little about the concept of Weltanschauung. He only mentions it in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And here it is sort of represented as I think he calls it like the moral Weltanschauung, which is something that only emerges as like a momentary stage of consciousness, but ultimately a kind of inadequate one. So for Hegel, the Weltanschauung is not something which is sort of like this homogeneous or teleological construct, as it is for the Kantians. It's almost like not really a concept for Hegel. So anyways, now we're jumping straight into the philosophical weeds, and that's probably where we want to be, but please, I'll kick it back to you.
I have a lot to cover, and so, what I've been studying, like the Emancipations podcast has like great study groups and has like been a sequence of amazing books. So that's kind of, but like what I've really been studying recently is the Lukács, getting into history and class consciousness. Rereading it, I feel like I read it like it was like a brand new thing, like I had never read it before or something. And Destruction of Reason. And then Engels has comments on like worldview and anti-doing. And anyway, just to kind of frame my brain right now, because I'm about to kind of maybe try to recapitulate some of the arguments from that I've been thinking about in like Lukács's History and Class Consciousness. I think that this idea of worldview is connected to the idea of totality, and that like Kant's work is, it has a restraint to it. I guess it like questions what reason can know. Can reason know the thing in itself, or have like an adequate concept of a totality? And he kind of wants to regulate, he doesn't want reason to generate monsters or something. He wants to keep it in check. And he kind of frames it with the idea of immediacy. And like, basically that with Kant, you have reason, you have like faculties of like, you have like a few faculties, and they do different things, but they're separated. They have different domains and different territories of application. You have like the critique of pure reason, which is mostly about like understanding things kind of like, I guess, scientifically, space and time, kind of Cartesian coordinate planes, and what we can know about the world in that way. And then you have like the critique of practical reason, which has to do with like a different faculty of reason with different domains about like moral relations. Like the is would be on the side of like the critique of pure reason, and the ought and what we ought to do is on the side of the other faculties, practical reason. And then you have the idea of a critique of judgment, which is kind of this third and ambiguous faculty that has a domain which might be related to judgments about art, about purposes in nature, because it seems like there's purposes in nature, but it's like, what can we actually say about how a plant comes to grow or something? Like it seems like it has some sort of evolution to it that is organic and natural. And a lot of like what we experience in the world seems to have some sort of like purposeness to it, or organicity to it. It holds together in a certain way. And I think what Lukács sees with Kant is that there's this like desire or a hope that reason has for kind of surpassing itself and thinking the totality. And he allows it a certain domain to do that activity, which would be kind of like this domain of judgment. And the judgments of that domain might not have the same quality as like a judgment about a scientific kind of causal connection or something, but basically like Kant at least gives a sense to philosophy that it hopes to do something that it really can't apply in all of the ways it would wish to. And I think
right.
the continuation of, German philosophy is like, but can we apply it further than that?
Mm-hmm.
Can we develop these totalities? Which kind of becomes this idea of worldview, I think, in a sense.
No, it's really good. It's like, in a sense, the sort of 4 questions of Kant: what can I know? What should I do? What may I hope for? And then finally, what is man? The kind of ultimate that sort of ties the bow upon the other 3. In a sense, what I think is at issue is the imminent realization of the ends of philosophy. And for Hegel, this is something which is resolved through the notion of absolute knowing, through a concept which is dialectics, introduces a sort of transient, almost you could say, forms of consciousness that are in a kind of dialectical conflictual relation with each other as forms. So they're not therefore thought as like static reflections of a culture or of a group or of a class. And this is where I feel as if the Marxist political question comes into the light, insofar as, one of the big questions here is in Hegel versus Kant, at least at the level of like applied social philosophy. One way you could understand the difference between the two is that the Kantians are more on the side that because there are intrinsic limits on human understanding, all we can really appeal to is human experience. Whereas the Hegelian wager is intrinsically more ambitious, right? Insofar as what the Hegelian wager is saying is no, there's actually a kernel of rationality, a kernel of reason that animates social life, and human groups are sort of in a dialectical relationship to it. That proposition, when applied to Marxism, becomes kind of the secret weapon for a type of class consciousness in the Lukácsian sense. And this is why I think that Lukács will say that Neo-Kantianism, not Kant, because Kant for Lukács is sort of like an open field. Kant is sort of the originator of a series of problems that are subsequently taken up by German idealism and Western philosophy as such, that don't necessarily restrict us to dogmatic silos as Neo-Kantianism sort of does. Because Neo-Kantianism is emerging in the wake of things like the materialism controversy. It's trying to respond to advances in science, whether that be Darwinism or advances in physiology or advances in psychology, and is trying to sort of map the Kantian framework onto science. And that's why you get all of these different kind of idiosyncratic philosophies and a kind of academic siloization of Kantianism and Hegelianism and so on. But I think for Lukács, what he wants to claim, right, which again is sort of his reading of the 19th century. I think that's the key thing, is that the 19th century is a living, organic system that still necessitates us as Marxists to analyze as in a process of continuation up to our present in a certain way, because the philosophical propositions that are open during this period of time hold the key to human emancipation, maybe you could say, and Kant does as well, right? It's the perversions of Kant's ideas that are problematic in Lukács's view. And so let's talk about a few of these problems. I mean, the first is that Lukács makes an interesting claim, right? That class consciousness of the bourgeoisie itself kind of possesses, in a homologous way, right, the limitations that Neo-Kantianism projects in its own philosophy, right? Which leads to a type of agnosticism, a type of indecision, a type of fetishization of immediacy and experience, right? And therefore it becomes a non-emancipatory philosophy, right? And so the Kant versus Hegel thing in Lukács's view is like the hinge of everything, I would say, in terms of Marxist philosophy. And I would read Engels in Anti-Düring and in Socialism, Utopian or Scientific as taking up the same general approach, right? That basically Hegel is out ahead of all of the kind of Kantian experimentations and alternatives, right? And the reason is that because here's what, as I would read it, why Hegel matters. Hegel matters because in order for the proletariat to serve as a sort of historical mission for the abolition of the capitalist way of social life and so on, to transcend it, right? What the Hegelian philosophy gives to the proletariat is a sort of strategy of its own dialectical self-realization and then emancipation that the Kantian system does not allow. What the Kantian system gives birth to is the possibility to integrate, instead of reason, the idea of kind of worldly intuition, for example, as that which, and we see this in Schelling. In fact, Schelling, more so than Kant, takes this idea of the noumenal limit of the Weltanschauung and develops his own idea of intuition, right? And there's an implicit aristocratic epistemology to Schelling's idea of intuition, insofar as it's applied to categories that are not tied to social being. Its mode of application is irrationalist because it's not grounded materially, I think, in Lukács's analysis of Schelling. And of course, I've had contemporary Schelling scholars like Christopher Sautour on the show, who's sort of kind of pushed back on that, and he's trying to make an argument that Schelling actually can be rehabilitated for a socialist materialist reading. I'm not so convinced of that, right? But that's actually one of the key things, is that I think the Kantian problematic does not ground a conception of the Weltanschauung through the prism of ontology understood through society, and therefore understood through materialism as the kind of bedrock of relations that make the possibility of the cognition of a worldview possible. That has to be thought in a materialist way, right? That's the kind of Marxist proposition on Weltanschauung, which is there has to be a social ontology applied to any, whether that be religious, whether that be class, worldview, etc. I guess the other final thing I'll say here is because Kant introduces in the third critique, which is interested in aesthetics and forms of aesthetic judgment, what I think becomes super interesting here, and we see this a lot in Nietzsche, of course, is the idea that the highest ideals of a given community are ultimately found within the domain of aesthetic judgment, right? But the intrinsic limits to what we can know in terms of the field of aesthetics, again, impose these certain limits. And I find that interesting also, and this is my final point. If we take seriously the idea that a worldview is born from aesthetics, meaning like a worldview ultimately touches the edges of what we can know of truth, beauty, etc., and that there's something about that general shared concept of aesthetic judgment that is what binds a worldview. This is like, for example, Lifshitz's argument in his study of Winckelmann, right? That object of aesthetic truth that binds a worldview if you want to do a genealogy of a worldview and you track its historical changes, it's very significant to see how the art that is produced, right, the aesthetics that are produced by members of a given Weltanschauung, like say the bourgeois Weltanschauung, how it changes, right? In other words, the aesthetic judgments of the collective class itself give you like the best proximity to knowing something about the Weltanschauung.
Yeah.
So I think these are some other key points I wanted to throw out. I'll kick it to you now.
So with Kant, it's like, I think the question is like, he's writing before the really like revolutionary moment of the rising class of the bourgeoisie. It's still like, a feudal period to some extent. And
he's writing, I would say he's writing before the revolutionary rise of the proletariat. Yes. He's writing at the moment at which bourgeoisie is ascendant. And in fact, what's so controversial about Kant is that Kant grounds his universal, this is why Kant is open for Lukács, is that he's actually claiming that the universalism implicit in what bourgeoisie is achieving in a materialist sense through the French Revolution, right, becomes the bedrock of his moral and social and political thought, right? So as such, if you then were to transplant that to the post-1848 period, right, the Kantian thing would look quite different than what liberal reactionary Kantians were doing after 1848. Does that make sense, Mathilde?
Well, it does, but what I mean to say is that the problem that later philosophers had with Kant, who were more involved in kind of like a political movement, was that there was no way for reason for what ought to be to make its way into what is. Because he separates these faculties and only allows their combination in aesthetic judgments and in scientific judgments about purposiveness, it does have a contemplative stance towards the world, what ought to be and what is. And so Lukács really has, like, in History and Class Consciousness, like, he tells this extremely fascinating narrative of the history of philosophy that moves from this contemplative stance that is very frustrating with people to a desire for like an active stance. And he shows how this goes by the way of like art, in the sense, like the idea that like that somehow there can be some sort of resolution to this conflict through art, or that like I guess like how to make the world beautiful again is like really, in a sense, like what History and Class Consciousness is about. It's like, okay, we're stuck in this world where like really everything is mediated by like numbers and by like scientific relations. We have this sense of what ought to be, and like the working classes maybe don't factor in Kant's estimation so much, but like they're subjected to this, this kind of flux of just like pure the immediate world of everybody is just this like surface of like he calls it reification, where like it seems like subjects aren't interceding. It's just money is mediating things. Money is like a quantitative value. The old natural kind of communities have been like eroded by a market economy, and like the world is just moving towards this new world of like capitalism, basically, where everything is just kind of mediated through like numbers, through quantitative market relations. it's very like, there's no, I mean, so like in addition to like Kant being like, yeah, you can't think the totality, there's also just the idea that like this emergent society has eroded the possibility of even thinking the totality. This is like more of like from Marx and Engels' ideas that like a commodity-based society has like kind of erodes the ability to conceive of the social totality in a true sense.
Right. And then the Kantian solution is inadequate insofar as if it imposes all of these limits on collective knowability of the totality, but we could sort of insert this often kind of used word totality. Perhaps we could insert something like the knowledge of societies, the knowledge of well, a few things. One would be a conception of collective interest that would be in line with social experience in a certain way that would be emancipatory. And I would argue that there's a necessary idea of mediation here. Insofar as in order for a proletarian to come into touch with totality, there must exist institutions of the working class that construct that form of worldview making. You could call it almost like worldview making philosophy. And this is actually the task of art and literature. So this is where like aesthetics would sort of enter back into the picture. And this is also why when he's talking about aesthetics and when we're invoking this concept, we're understanding it as a positive constructive project. And that's actually like the kind of Engelsian animating force of anti-Dühring, or some of this like form of Marxism that I find so compelling insofar as what its presupposition is sort of like the idea that in order to come to know the means to transform class oppression, there must be created ways for like worldview building to transpire. And this must take a series of different forms. So for example, this is why socialist realism becomes this strategy. It's like a strategy of aesthetics for encouraging large scale shifts in consciousness towards socialist worldview building. And I feel as if that movement there is what is in so much in abeyance, or so missing in today's thinking of socialist strategy. Like today, we often think about socialist strategy largely in an American context, in which we have like, you know, such a decline in the trade union movement, such a kind of underdeveloped possibility of doing political action outside of bourgeois party dominance. But we also, in the face of that decline, right, which is a political economic decline in a very economic oriented domain of social life, the more interesting question to me is like, well, what about the other side of what about the aesthetic side of socialism? What does that actually look like, you know? That's to me what this question of worldview kind of introduces. And I think we should also say this, Mathilde, is that part of the reason why worldview is important, I would contend, and I want your thoughts on this too, is that it becomes a kind of antonym, right, to ideology in its own way. Now, we have to be careful when we say that, because we're not arguing for like a kind of positivism of the worldview, right, whereby the proletariat has some unique access to the truth of society because it is oppressed. That actually is a kind of liberal, interesting liberal perversion on the idea of standpoint theory, right, whereby Lukács argues this idea of the standpoint of the proletariat, but he doesn't, I think, mean by standpoint of proletariat something which is to be understood as locked within the confines of an autonomous experience. Because this kind of goes back to the violence of worldview. If each community or each like stratum in the hierarchy of human communities have their own self-enclosed worldview, right, that gives them identity or gives them uniqueness, you can see immediately why this would actually be the formula for a certain type of intergroup rivalry. And this is why, by the way, it's not a surprise, according to Lukács, that the concept of a multiplicity of Weltanschauungs emerges at the it coincides with the intensification of imperialism. So you see, the imperatives of capitalism, as it becomes more imperialist, produces a kind of violence of worldviews, and it's a clashing of worldviews. I think what's really interesting about the proletarian position here is that it cuts across homogeneous worldviews, and it therefore distorts the homogeneity of worldview. And this is why, when I was speaking to Angela Hartunayan from Beirut, American University of Beirut, who's an expert on Lifshitz and socialist realism, she made a very nice point, which is that Lukács and Engels and all of these Marxist theorists of Weltanschauung never maintained that there's something like a proletarian worldview. Because the proletarian worldview is coming into existence, as I said in a prior conversation we had, on the kind of carcass of the exhaustion of the bourgeois worldview. It's in a dialectical relationship to the bourgeois worldview. It's not to be understood as some like enclave unto itself. I wanted your thoughts on that, and we can go back to ideology. I kind of introduced ideology, but we can go back to that.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of add a few of these points. What would you say?
Yes. I would say that I think the question of worldview has been going on for a long time. Like, I think the question of like history and like kind of like relativism with like Montaigne and Pascal, I think there's this idea of like, what is true? What is justice? Like what, with like, I guess like the world market forming, all these different experiences. I think, in the colonial period as well, there was like a similar kind of like the beginnings of like anthropology or something, where you have like, wow, there's all of these different societies. Like, what is true? What is, how should, what is the right way to orient people? So I think there is like, this problematic is gigantic in a certain way.
Right. No, that's very nice, Mathilde. I just want to say one little point on that. Hold your thought, because just one of Lukács's students, this very interesting figure by the name of Lucien Goldman, he argues in a beautiful way, and this is something we can also introduce later as well. Not only is every Weltanschauung kind of tied together by aesthetics and aesthetic production and aesthetic objects, but oftentimes Weltanschauungs become the expression of a philosophical perspective. And he argues that the philosophical perspective of Blaise Pascal, which is characterized by a type of unique fatalist resignation from the world, and is characterized by a certain pessimism regarding the human condition and original sin, through Pascal's allegiance, of course, to the conservative Catholic philosophy of Jansenism. Goldman wrote a book called The Hidden God, and his argument there is that Pascalianism becomes the Weltanschauung of what would become bourgeoisie. And just one final point there, and this is very nice. Why that it matters is because it emerges from the conflict of another competing worldview, which he identifies coming out of the Augustinian tradition as Pelagian. And what this refers to is like a very interesting church schism and scandal of Pelagius, who fought against this idea of eternal damnation and original sin, and therefore was on the side of what you might call, in Goldman's sense, like rudimentary Marxism.
Yeah.
And you see what they've done is they've given us a way to see a dialectic of worldview conflict that plays itself out at different stages of history, whereby the Pelagian universalist position is about, yes, human redemption and human freedom is realizable in the world. The Pascalian position is it's not. It's not going to work that way.
Yeah.
Bourgeoisie, because it becomes an emancipatory class that then is forced to be the administrators of a system of domination and oppression, i.e. capitalism, finds some great value in the Pascalian worldview. So worldviews become like pragmatic instruments for the self-sustaining basis of a worldview. Sorry, I just wanted to say that as well.
That book is fascinating by Lucien Goldman, and everyone should read a little bit of Pascal just to get the experience of it. I think that I feel like Lukács's project, at least in History and Class Consciousness, and I think and Destruction of Reason too, is like, well, definitely in History and Class Consciousness is this, it's very romantic to me. It's very like all-consuming, redemptive, fervent, and it tracks this history of philosophy going into like basically that like this idea of like how to make a reasonable world, basically, and that like in fact like reason is in history, that like maybe history has a certain like immanence of reason throughout it. It's tracked through this idea of like I was saying, like this idea from like art to Hegel, like how to construct this idea of like a totality for the humans, and like Hegel's, I think, jump is to think practice in some way, to bring in the idea of practice, and that whatever immediacy that we experience in our worlds is relative to the different practices that are occurring, and
right,
and that to get from there, and then this idea of like consciousness, that each stage of a different quality of the immediacy of the world is accompanied by a different degree of consciousness about the world in a certain way, and that, you know, there's this kind of like apocalyptic idea in there that like humans like can construct a reasonable world, and they can like come to this point where like they realize that they had been constructing it all along, that it had always been their construction. It had been unconscious,
right,
but now it can be conscious.
yeah,
and how this gets transferred, I mean, and then this, so that the idea of like immediacy being a product of practices gets taken up by Marx and Engels, in the sense that for them, they see that like the immediacy we experience in a capitalist society is that like money has like a rate of growth or something, or that like just like whatever is evident to our world and given, like that, like we're all kind of like atoms in the society, and that we go to the market for things, and like that there's like a natural rate of inflation, there's a natural rate of unemployment, like all of these like kind of abstractions of our world, that they're generated through some certain practices. And he also brings in this idea of like categories of mediation, I guess, or like, so I guess like just to finish my thought about like what I think Marx and Engels want to do with this is like to go from the place where like you get to the point that like what you see, like this world is, I guess like you think how to get to the point of like seeing processes rather than just things.
Yeah.
And that sounds very general. Maybe we could make that a bit more concrete. But like kind of like what is supposed to be revealed in like reading Capital or something is this idea that that there are two classes and that like they're self-reproducing, and that what seems like these individual instances of like each person doing these individual things is a part of this larger process that is like self-reproducing,
right?
Which is certainly not evident on the surface of everyone's reality. That like the life of the capitalist of like and the worker are like directly interconnected with each other, and dependent upon each other, like poles or something.
Yeah.
And then for Lukács, he basically like, so I think Engels like takes this idea and is like, oh, this is like this idea that like history is a process. He takes it in a slightly different fashion. I think Lukács wants to say that like he's almost more Hegelian maybe than Engels, where it's like this experience or revelation about like the world being like a process rather than just like this immediate given, these just collection of things, is like in the wage worker coming to realize that they're a commodity.
Yeah.
And it's like that is the first initial point of consciousness that allows for a view of the concrete totality, which is kind of like the concrete totality, I think, once it gets fully developed, is like the idea that there's like classes in society, and like in a capitalist mode of production, there's like two classes, and like one of them is exploited basically. And like there are steps along the way of the oppressed class coming to consciousness, and at each step it reveals a more like true picture of the concrete totality, and that only that subject position or the class in society can actually illustrate the concrete totality in an adequate fashion. So to answer your point, like it does seem like the proletariat standpoint, that somehow the owning class can't really have an understanding of the society that they live in, because for them, I guess they're able to operate in the given world of immediacy with like their calculations and everything, I suppose. Like but like knowledge of the totality is only gained through practice for Lukács. So like the science of knowing the concrete totality is like embedded in the historical process of the non-owning class coming to consciousness of its position. And so like every step of gaining consciousness is also a step, and this could also be like political practice, or it's unclear to me what the category of practice is really doing. Like, is it just like reading Marx's Capital, or is it being in a political party and like engaging in practice in that way? Like that would actually be able to reshape the world. But yeah, like I think in Lukács, especially in History and Class Consciousness, it's like the science of understanding the concrete totality is embedded in a subject position, coming into consciousness of itself through a variety of practices, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's really nice. And I feel like there is a sort of ascendancy, or even like a stages of consciousness. There's different you could say orders of mediation. And I think that there is also therefore a conception that the consciousness that Marxism deems scientific, if we were to read, for example, the opening section of Anti-Düring by Engels, we could even, perhaps as an exercise, just like read it aloud. Of course, part of what he's trying to do in this text is not merely respond to Düring, which who was that? This we have a study group on Düring on the YouTube page for those interested, but by Landon Frim, it's very good. But Düring was trying to kind of do what Marxism hadn't yet done, but which is implied in Marxism, which is to provide a comprehensive philosophical statement, which includes a statement about aesthetics in a certain way, about what socialism is. And so what Anti-Düring is trying to do is sort of, if you've ever read like the 1844 Paris manuscripts by Marx, where he talks about the different stages of socialism leading up to his own time, where you had like primitive communism, you had utopian socialism, you had religious communism, for example, right? Engels is trying to give like a different account about the advancement of philosophy's relationship to the socialist movement in Anti-Düring. But one of the things that he also says there is that knowledge of the possibility of a mode of social life that would have a rationalist relationship to, I think he uses the concept of productive planning, is the sort of elementary, or one of the elementary features of scientific socialism. And what I found that to be why I found that to be interesting is, of course, because of the question about revolution and reformism. Insofar as what Engels is sort of saying there is that the consciousness of the proletariat, or the proletariat's relationship to philosophy, will necessitate the realization that a mode of productive life, or a mode of production that dispenses rationally and that can transcend anarchy, uses anarchy of bourgeois production, is possible. So in other words, it's necessary to construct a form of practice that would make realizable a mode of production that could dispense with a rationally planned society, right? Now, because the class position of bourgeoisie in a decadent and deteriorating and crisis-prone capitalist system, I think it's essential to say crisis-prone, because we remember in Capital, volumes 1 and volume 2, and Rosa Luxemburg is very good on this in her discussion regarding primitive accumulation, which is that in order for the reproduction of capitalism to function adequately, it begins with a kind of pillage or a kind of primitive a scene of primitive accumulation, which is subsequently forgotten by the capitalist class and disavowed, but then realized at the end of the reproduction cycle, what Marx calls extended reproduction. Now, there's two general departments of the reproduction of capitalism. There is the forces and relations of production that exist within the multiplicity of various modes of production, like manufacturing and different forms of industry and so on. Those are kind of political economic. But there's also the sphere of social reproduction, which is like the sphere of exchange and consumption that makes possible the social reproduction of the proletariat to be a laboring class. It is the sphere of social reproduction which the capitalist class can forget and disregard. In other words, when they create a new firm or a new corporation or a new venture, in fact, Marx says there's a higher level of, he doesn't use the term disavowal, but I think it works, or even fetishism, about the way that their endeavors, the way that they're implanting capitalism is itself reliant on the total interconnection between these two departments. In other words, they can proceed as if what they are seeking to extract, the surplus they're seeking to extract, is not dependent on the sphere of social reproduction. And this is why, like in a basic sense, the capitalist class can say, no, we don't need to give the workers health insurance. We don't need to give the workers a increase in quality of life. In fact, as a method for greater discipline, we would take these things away only to leave them at the level of bare subsistence. To be a docile class is what's necessary. So what I'm trying to say is that the ambition of the Marxist claim on the scientific basis of socialism and why the proletariat has an advantage is because they do live the interconnection between these two departments day in and day out, if that makes sense. I think that, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that a conversation about social reproduction is very helpful to understand Lukács's point that you're articulating, if that makes sense, right? Which is, and part of the problem that this becomes so thorny, right, is that forms of liberal practice which do not submit to scientific socialism, in other words, forms of political practice which do not posit the necessity for the transcendence of the capitalist mode of production, right, can use some general insights here for their own conception of what qualifies as political. That's where things become problematic, in my opinion, where you get weird pseudo-Marxist kind of applications of standpoint theory, for example, that don't really have a connection to something like the totality. Because again, the totality is the knowledge of the interconnection and interreliance of the various departments of the capitalist system for its own general reproduction. That's totality. Totality is not some mystical absolute that only a few can know. That's irrationalist epistemology. And there's a lot of that. And in fact, Lukács's argument in Destruction of Reason is that as capitalism becomes more imperialistic, those kinds of epistemologies will need to flourish, or they will emerge. And I felt like this is a good way to understand so much of contemporary Silicon Valley ideology. Insofar as the AI revolution underneath it, right, is a avowal on behalf of the capitalist class for the eradication of basic forms of liberal equality that they perceive as unnecessary to capitalism. In fact, their claim would be that society will be more stable. The degree to which it will be more stable, the more we eliminate forms of basic liberal egalitarianism, right? And that becomes very tricky for Marxists, because we know that egalitarianism, when it is treated in a kind of partial way by bourgeois ideology, is sort of like a half promise. Like it's something, but it's not connected to science. So what I'm trying to say, Mathilde, is like, maybe we could go back to the opening of Anti-Durian and like tease out its consequences, because I feel like it's almost axiomatic what Engels is saying, like axioms of science, and that like our practice proceeds from these, like it proceeds from these presuppositions. So let me get your thoughts on that, and then I'll bring up the text and we can read it.
Yeah, I feel like the AI stuff is like certainly going to create like a social movement, like I think socialism came about under, at least in Europe, under a similar condition of like this change, like the, are you still there, Daniel? I'm wondering if it's frozen. Oh, we're good. Okay, you're back. I mean, this idea of like machine industry being introduced, and like the social contract remains the same in a certain way, but the conditions under which it's like operating have changed substantially. And there's this just strong sense of like injustice that comes up, and there's just like extreme suffering everywhere. Is like scarcity, people like being unemployed, like people like having no idea what the future holds for them. Like I think like that in a strong sense like is the conditions that Engels pointing to, of like the emergence of socialism as a movement. And yeah, I think the AI revolution is very similar. I suppose like we'd have to answer like, so this like contradiction, like Engels thinks that there's a solution to it. And I think it does require politics. And so like, as you'd see like this idea of like these tech people like being against like egalitarian politics, like maybe they know what's at stake here, or at least trying to cover their vulnerabilities. So that's kind of my thoughts on the subject.
No, it's really good. Let's read the opening passage, if we could, to Engels here from Anti-Durian, just to get a sense of, I guess maybe to underscore what we're trying to,
For sure,
what we're trying to say here. So let me start from, yes, I guess, well, I was going to start from the philosophy section, but I think it's actually better to start here.
The introduction.
Yes.
I think that first paragraph we could
Yeah.
do a lot with it.
Yeah. So Engels writes, modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition, on the one hand, of the class antagonisms existing in the society of today between proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers, on the other hand, of the anarchy existing in production. But in its theoretical form, modern socialism originally appears ostensibly as a more logical extension of the principles laid down by the great French philosophers of the 18th century. Like every new theory, modern socialism had, at first, to connect itself with the intellectual stock and trade ready to its hand, however deeply its roots lay in economic facts. So, what he's saying here, I think, is two things. One is French rationalism makes, or is the sort of philosophical origin point that makes ultimately a sort of crescendo point realized of modern socialism in Hegelian thought. And Hegelian thought is the sort of natural heir to these French philosophers of materialism from the 18th century on into the 19th century in German idealism. And like, for example, like Diderot and some of the Enlightenment philosophers and Rousseau and things like this. But what they make possible is a certain sense of reason or a certain sense of scientific truth. And here we can kind of ask, I think, how Engels might relate to science. Like, does he mean Wissenschaft? And what is actually Engels's sort of scientific object? So we'll get to that in a moment. So that's principle number 2. But the first principle, right, is this 2-part claim that class antagonisms are coursing through the capitalist system in relations of proprietors and non-proprietors, capitalists and wage workers, and the basic class system is therefore overdetermined by these class antagonisms, that is causing a certain anarchy in production. But I perceive him as arguing that modern socialism begins from the premise that another form of let's call it like non-anarchical production is possible. And here we're introduced, I think, to the interesting point about rational planning and scientific socialism as a method for large-scale rational planning of economies that would promise an end to these forms of, right? But what I think is very interesting and what makes him different than Chartism, what makes him different than utopian socialism, what makes the claim different than all other forms of socialism, including Düring, is the idea that this form of rational planning will have root and branch overcome the source of capitalist value, which is the most revolutionary economic system ever created, right? But which all forms of socialism heretofore before Marxism have been unable to transcend. That's my read of the first paragraph. There's more to say, but I'll kick it to you for your read.
I think he's saying that modern socialism, in its essence, is related to the recognition of class antagonisms between owners and non-owners, especially in the cases of, like, I guess, modern capitalism, where like the non-proprietors show up naked to the workplace and are like are integrated into this this system or whatever, and the anarchy existing in production being, I wonder, if this is just related to like the money economy, because what they emphasize is like the workplaces have been rationalized, and like labor is now like a huge team group project. It's not just like individual workers who can put into motion their tools or whatever. It's like these massive interconnected social phenomena. But like still you have the legal relations, that there's some people who own them and some people who don't. And it's like legal relations for a simpler time, when that don't correspond to reality. And so I guess like instead of planning, I think, I think planning is like an underlying thing in here, but like I think the legal relations are really important. Like the kind of the general socialist assumption, like, a person shouldn't be able to own like heavy industry, kind of that like assumption about socialism is like those sorts of industries should be nationalized. And I think like in its extreme form, I think that is kind of what Marx and Engels are pointing to, is like these machine industries that are like highly rationalized, huge division of labor, integrating like global markets, all, you know, it's just like this massive interconnected enterprise shouldn't be owned by it shouldn't possibly be owned by any one person, in its most like kind of minimal form there. But I think when he's saying like in its essence, I think he's saying that like modern socialism just kind of emerged. It doesn't really know. It knows that there's classes, but it doesn't know like maybe like why there's classes. And it's experiencing these things, and it tries to understand them through these theoretical forms of prior periods. And I think the pointing to the French philosophers is this idea of like, I think it's the French materialists that like were a part of like the French Revolution. And I think people who wanted to like, who believed that they could have an immanent explanation of the world from nature, like it didn't require any transcendent principles, like that you could just understand the world from out of itself. But I think like the problem with these prior like materialists is that like they didn't have a historical conception, or their theories weren't adequate to dialectical objects or whatever objects, you know, that are historical. And what the German philosophy kind of introduces is modes of thinking historical objects. And this is where you get into like the weird stuff about Hegelian dialectics and Hegelian logic. Like, what is this stuff? Why are these categories like transforming? And like, what is this straight? So it's like, I think eventually German philosophy gets into the point of like, okay, what sort of types of knowledge are going to like allow us to think these like historical objects? And then what Marx and Engels do, and they basically say like, yes, I like what you were doing with those, like thinking like these forms of thought that are in motion, and going back to the materialist and saying, but actually we can do this with an immanent explanation from nature itself, with no transcendent principles. We don't require a world spirit, you know, like whatever was working throughout history doesn't seem to be like material to us. And that I think eventually it's like, I don't know how they necessarily set it down exactly, but I think that's kind of the way their thinking's going.
No, I think that's really good. Yes. And what I think is interesting here regarding Weltanschauung is the sense in which I think we've tried to articulate a few points. One is, first off, there's a dialectic between capitalism as a system in a constant state of social reproduction that is built into that, which is crisis prone, and class struggle introduces a type of generalized social anxiety and deterioration, therefore, on one's relationship to a given worldview. In other words, one could say, perhaps in a certain way, that if I am a religious, part of the reason that capitalist society stokes traditionalism, like trad culture, is precisely because of this deleterious crisis-prone basis of capitalism, where it sends us clinging to or searching for or trying to find some type of belonging or connection, which is not present to us as a result of these forces of social alienation to begin with. So that's happening. Another thing that's happening is that superimposed onto religious or ethnic or even any other worldview in capitalist society are the materialist imperatives of the class system itself. So therefore, each like sub community, or like in the Kantian liberal vision of cosmopolitan reason, right? The Marxist idea was that, well, sure, within the UN or within the nation state apparatus or within any kind of liberal appeal to democratic representation, well, sorry to tell you, but all of those sub communities are riddled with internal class antagonisms, and their elements, therefore, or strata within them, are reflective of interests which are often unconscious to the actors that are tied into the imperatives of the capitalist system. And moreover, across all of these cosmopolitan communities, you can identify a kind of a mole, or a kind of a force of a proletarian form of becoming. And this is a political force, right? There's a sort of subjective political force to that. But that political force does not come into the world with some preordained or kind of like clean worldview unto itself. No, if anything, what it is, its strength is that it is trying to sort of construct a worldview for a society beyond capitalism. So therefore, I would say the thesis of the proletariat implies a kind of baseline utopianism, but not a preformed utopianism. It's like a kind of a series of practices that must be cultivated and nurtured, perhaps. And that is what we would call like worldview Marxism. Now, let's now kind of move up the historical genealogical story we're trying to tell here and introduce let's introduce, I mean, we could introduce Wilhelm Dilthey, and I know you've done a lot of work on Dilthey, and you know, he's a very kind of forgotten figure, he's a very interesting figure, but during his time, very prominent. Edmund Husserl had this huge debate, and the origin of phenomenology is kind of a rejection of Dilthey. But Dilthey was, I guess he was like the chair of Hegelian studies in Berlin in the late 1800s into the turn of the 20th century. And he put forward a concept of Weltanschauung philosophy at the center of his thought. And it was all presupposed on a kind of taxonomy of worldviews. And there is a kind of, I would say, Mathilde, like a kind of implicit political liberalism implied there, a certain way. We can also talk about his Diltheyan approach and so on. But then the other thing I wanted to throw onto the table as well is how the kind of masters of suspicion, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, obviously we've said a lot about Marx, but Freud and Nietzsche kind of destroy, in a way, the coherence of Weltanschauung. Freud famously has a text on the worldview, on the concept of worldview. And at issue for Freud is this idea, it's a late text actually, but at issue of Freud, I think, is, and we can talk about this a little bit, but I mean, a whole episode could be done on this text, is the idea that there's something deeply flawed in regards to the presupposition that there are coherent worldviews that are like collectively or sensibly shared amongst individuals. Because for Freud, a worldview is sort of like the expression of a kind of, it could very well be an expression of a regressive stage of development, for example, right? There's a certain completely different conception of the human being, of what is human, according to Freud. The same goes with Nietzsche. Insofar as Nietzsche, like the Marquis de Sade, I would claim, is trying to sort of say that my philosophy is capable of identifying the way that dominant worldviews, in his case Christianity, kind of determine all other worldviews. And there's a way to sort of extinguish the impure, the weak, right? So from the vitalist point of view, like the kind of strength and weak forces that compose a worldview can be cleansed, and you can sort of have a purification of a worldview in a certain way. which is ultimately in the name of a kind of destruction, let's destroy this this bad worldview because it's producing subjects that are sort of devitalized or impotent or something like this. So obviously here we get into like reactionary vitalism and so on and so forth. But I suppose maybe we could start with your impressions on Wilhelm Dilthey. His contributions to the concept of worldview would be important because he's not really a reactionary philosopher, I don't think, even though he is grounding his conception of the Weltanschauung in a conception of life. And most philosophers that do that, I think, have tended to at least produce social and political conclusions that are pretty suspect. But you're sort of like a defender of Dilthey, is that right? Would you
No,
say that?
I don't think so. I think I think that what I've read some of his stuff. I think the hermeneutic tradition is, I think that would be like something that kind of stems from this style of thinking of thinking interpretation, like thinking that like explanation isn't appropriate to historical phenomena, especially in the human sciences. And so like the dichotomy between like, can human society only be like interpreted and empathized with in order to like make sense of it versus like natural phenomena? Or like, are there like laws in nature, maybe something more like social Darwinism or like, other 19th century traditions of thinking history through like a certain type of lawfulness that would be like a natural science? And then like the question of whether like Marx and Engels' thoughts how it would fall into those two like types of either explanation or description and interpretation. Like, I think most people would slot it into an explanatory framework. I think Dilthey might have some fascinating writings on, especially like the biographies of like Goethe or different historical figures. And I'm sure there's things that can be gained from like exposure to that sort of historical research. I do think that I found it fairly unconvincing as like, how would it help me like solve my problems in the world? I think it is a contemplative philosophy in a certain way. It's an attempt to understand the different meanings of humans and their cultures and their symbol analysis. Maybe to try to say a few words about like what Lukács thinks of it is that he frames it in the Neo-Kantian tradition that had like prior to the imperialist period, exercised caution towards what sort of I guess explanations or attempts at knowledge it would conduct towards human sciences. So it really is in the debate of like the human sciences versus the natural sciences. What can we know? Very interesting questions, of course. And I think that he attempts from kind of this careful Kantian tradition to open the door again to understanding human societies. But he does frame it within an interpretive tradition rather than like an explanatory one.
Right. No, it's true. And there's also a sense in which Dilthey is a thinker who's trying to, in Lukács's reading, and I'm sure Dilthey scholars would sort of maybe push back against this, But one of the things he says, right, is that, well, if you look back at historical epochs, they come to concretize their essence through a Weltanschauung. So you have like a kind of the romantic Weltanschauung. You have like the age of Goethe and its promises formulate something that we historically can identify sort of the boundaries of that worldview. And one of the things he's trying to arrive at or conclude is sort of what the modern Weltanschauung would be. And this, I think, is very interesting because, in a sense, what we get from this period of late imperialist philosophy is the sense, in fact, that there are these sort of rivalrous worldviews trying to gain sort of supremacy, right? And I think myth and intuition, which is at the core of the irrationalist wager, that like the claim there is that, yes, myth and intuition can be inserted into the logic that would cohere a nation state identity project, which could be, you know, a kind of highly fascistic project, say, for example. All of that can kind of, and, you know, we see this a bit in Spengler, who, you know, the decline of the West kind of perverts Weltanschauung philosophy in its own way as a saga of morphological worldviews of civilizations coming into, like there's a kind of inner logic of them, an inner science of them, a kind of teleology of them, which then is sort of eminently applied to the fate of modern civilization. And there's sort of, there then becomes almost like an apocalyptic predictive history that emerges from this field of study that can be highly idiosyncratic to the political whims of the philosopher, which is why I think in Marx and Engels' case, their conception of philosophy is very much trying to avoid the idea that Marx would be the definition of the new society. You know, this vulgar idea that, oh yeah, Marx himself, the great bearded Marx, would be the kind of composite mythical image that the proletariat would become in the name of or the image of. That's not what's going on here, which is why I'm trying to exert so much caution when we say worldview Marxism. Because it's not a fetishization of some kind of personified worldview. Does that make sense, Mathilde?
Yes.
Let me say this, though. Like, oh, just as a very interesting aside point, you had shared with me 1979 encyclopedia from the Soviet Union that defines the Weltanschauung. One of the things I found so interesting there was that the Soviet definition of worldview quotes Marx about the meaning of genius, of like a great genius individual. And then I followed the footnote. I followed the citation back, and I realized that this was an essay that Marx wrote when he was 18, when he was in high school. And I was thinking to myself, wait a second, they've just applied a conception of the worldview as precisely the irrationalist personification of Marx the genius. Which is why, if you think about it, like even in like the kind of conception of the, because like I hear you would have to almost follow Lifshitz' lead and ask, well, how did the architecture of the Soviet system conceive of its own worldview? Right? Like where does the mythical representation of Marx reside within? And I think here they're sort of showing their cards in a way which is very unfortunate. Does this make sense what I'm articulating?
Yes, I see what you're saying there. I think like what we haven't really introduced is the idea of like Marxism as like a science, in a sense. Like, if it was a science, it's not the product of one great mind, by definition, in a sense. Like, it's a project greater than one mind. I think that Lukács struggles to think of Marxism, like historical materialism, as like a science that is separate from the consciousness of the proletariat. It's like only through, like, I guess, like, Marxism is supposed to provide like an account of history, and it's supposed to see like somehow in the historical process some sort of reason, maybe from like necessity to freedom, like some large framing of the historical process of human destiny or something. And I think, there is certain indications in like Marx and definitely in Lukács of like the riddle of history solved, like these like really profound romantic revelations, like Hegelian philosophy, or something. But basically, like, I struggle to read Lukács's interpretation of Dilthey as being like the only explanation. Like, basically, I think he more or less comes down the side that like maybe like Dilthey can't see reason in history. Lukács comes up with this kind of framing of saying that like he's basically a subjective idealist at the end of the day. That, well, I can't really recreate the idea, but with Lukács, I feel like he falls in to a kind of like I don't see how he distinguishes himself as necessarily so much more scientific than Dilthey.
This is a good point because, first of all, he argues in The Destruction of Reason that Dilthey is a transitional figure who emerges kind of before the intense imperialist period, and therefore his conception of the worldview is like less politicized than it would be in later thinkers. Now, it's interesting that he says that, though, because in a certain way I felt like that chronology is slightly wrong insofar as Dilthey's influence is still very much present at the turn of the century into 1920s and so on. So that's one point. Second point is he says that unlike many Neo-Kantians, Dilthey had developed a kind of quasi-materialist understanding of worldviews, grounded in a conception of social being, but which didn't go far enough in terms of a positive transcendence of the bourgeois capitalist social order. And in that sense, he gives a lot of epistolary quotes of like Dilthey's letters to colleagues where he confesses, Dilthey says that my system is fundamentally based on skepticism and that I don't have a practice. So I understand Lukács's criticism of him kind of like that, which is like, you have an unrefined, it's the same critique that Engels gives to so many socialists of a Kantian variety. The problem with them is that they fall into a trap of agnosticism where they get kind of caught within bourgeois immediacy and the inevitable dualism of the Kantian is-ought distinction that prevents them from taking decisive revolutionary action. Because I would claim that maybe there's a larger prescriptive point that the Marxist philosopher is making onto bourgeois philosophy, because we should always remember, like you see this in Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, there is a way that philosophers have an unthinking or an uncritical relationship to their own class interests. And as such, this limitation is something that Marxists will want to pinpoint, will want to tease out. And I think that a lot of the times, this is what Lukács is doing in Destruction of Reason, pointing to that, like, how bourgeois philosophy is inadequate because it's not capable of taking decisive action. And decisive action is centered on the locus of an acknowledgement of the class struggle. This is one of the points of the definition of what irrationalism is, which is a philosophy which acknowledges the class struggle, but then seeks to cover it over or reroute it or kind of pervert it or mystify it. Dilthey is sort of a minor character. Nietzsche is a major character in the same period of time. Who performs this act, this mystification, right? It's almost like a matter of degree in the Destruction of Reason. It's like philosophers that are on the spectrum of irrationalism are defined by the degree to which there's a relationship between their knowledge of the deteriorating system of capitalism, and then that knowledge then becomes the basis of the construction, let's say, of a theory of nature that seeks to then justify capitalism. So Dilthey has a kind of theory of society and nature that is skeptical about the realities of the capitalist system. So that's my reading of it, is that he's bringing that kind of approach to it in a certain way.
Can I say?
Please jump in.
Yeah, like I think like decadence and like the maintenance and the embracing of decadence is like, I think Nietzsche and Dilthey like are accused by Lukács of this.
Yeah.
And like what I take decadence to mean is basically like embracing the forms of reification of modern society and not having really like a desire to surmount them. And that like what reason is for Lukács and progress is like surpassing decadence and reification, and to bringing reason into the world. Reason can only be brought into the world through the historical practice of the oppressed class creating a new society. And I guess like, yeah, I just wanted to add that to this as well.
This is why I think ideology can be defined in line with what you're articulating, because bourgeois philosophy almost becomes ideological when it begins from a premise. This is like why Marxism is like the new Pelagian scandal of modern life, because the impulse is to pretend that we're not affected by these contradictions of the class antagonisms that Marxism is bringing, that is alerting us to, right? And the degree of honesty and integrity of a philosopher is gauged on the extent to which they will acknowledge these hard truths. Yeah. But ideologically, they can construct, whole escape routes from those truths. And I just find it so interesting that Marxism in today's time has somehow seemingly lost its status as a pressure valve onto bourgeois philosophy that it used to have. Because I feel as if, as Marxist philosophers, we should be in the service of reminding philosophers, all philosophers, of these problems. And in fact, we should be in the service of reminding people that the same magnitude that Engels tried to remind people is still present today. And if that's true, which I believe it is true, then that gives Marxism a philosophical vocation for today's time. Right? That's powerful in my opinion. That kind of seems to me to be like the kind of main outcome of why we are going back and focusing on this material, because that's a pretty radical conclusion. Would you agree with that, or would you?
Yeah, it sounds right to me. I mean, schematically speaking, like if like modern socialism is arising from these like contradictions, and like bourgeois society created these like legal apparatus, and it was, you know, it didn't create such strong social contradictions initially, and then with the kind of evolution of machine industry creating these very intense contradictions, you have like the bourgeoisie basically saying like, we were trying to create like a reasonable society, but we're going to abdicate that whole period of our revolutionary period, when we were saying outright that that was our goal, to, you know, and I guess, yeah, like philosophy, like proletarian philosophy, or I don't, what you would even call it, would certainly have to be honest about these questions. And I guess like what you brought to mind was like, the social contradictions are certainly evident. Is Marxism a science that points to these things, that has like the validity of a science? Or is it, or is the philosopher more on the side of a political position? I suppose in the sense that maybe Lukács would be thinking here, or in history and class consciousness, where practice is always integrated into, not even just practice, but like overcoming capitalist social forms is a part of like the production of science and of knowledge, where like maybe the question of like the scientific validity of Marxism is not a central question. It is liberation of humanity, or the redemption of humans. Seems to be, certainly in history class consciousness, a stronger focus. And I think that's like where I get the Husserl Dilthey debate. I think Husserl is saying basically like, you have abdicated the task of philosophy to base itself on like scientific validity or reason or rationalism. You're not concerned about that. And I wonder if Husserl's critique could also be pointed at Lukács. And I guess it's just because this idea that the political practice of the proletariat is related to its emerging full consciousness seems to not be, I guess, what I would consider scientific, I suppose. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I guess we'd have to introduce this question of method and the question of how Marxism sees the propagation and the transmission of its own method to the proletariat. Now that introduces like a whole question about the division of mental and manual labor. It introduces a question about the merger formula, the relationship between the intellectual and the worker. And I think that all of those are a part of the question about what Lukács is trying to impart, apropos. Like, he's trying to, as I read him, insist in the face of a series of socialist uprisings, a series of acute socialist possible revolutions, uprisings where the system is at its weakest. There seems to be a problem, which is that the question regarding the proletariat's knowledge of is somehow at issue. Its knowledge regarding its role as a catalytic force in the overcoming of capitalism is what's at issue. And I think that he's wanting to both sort of make more ambitious the object of the proletariat's revolutionary knowledge by creating this situation of a dialectic between, I would say, sort of like three general forces: socialist intellectuals, the Workers' Party, and the class itself. And there seems to be like a kind of a question that Lukács wants to tease out regarding, well, how can this dialectic proceed in such a way where we mediate and concretize a form of consciousness which would be fully capable of preparing the class in a total sense for the transition to the new society and so on. So it's like, in a way, I think it's very interesting also to think about this in relationship to the fact that at this time, after 1917, you had a lot of socialist revolutions, which almost you could define as aborted or halfway, including in Hungary, right? Including where Lukács was himself based, where the forces of bourgeois reaction took over the positive development of the dictatorship of the proletariat and effectively aborted it in a certain way. So he's writing history and class consciousness in the wake of those defeats and those aborted revolutions. And so it's a very interesting project because I do think that it injects into our thinking a form of an ambitious educational project, which is very hard to often sort of conceptualize, especially today. It's hard to conceptualize today because he's writing it on the back of a very, very well-developed workers' movement. So it doesn't really make sense. Now, here's where the problem again comes in, I think, is that people kind of sort of take this apparatus of this ambitious educational revolutionary idea in the context of a liberal social order that we live in, and kind of neglect that the institutions that may be bringing Lukács into them kind of haven't adequately developed their own purposive direction as a sort of fund. And that actually reintroduces a different end goal of education than what Lukács was after, I would argue. It almost makes things we need to go back to more basic fundamentals, perhaps. I don't know if that makes sense, but so there's that issue. But I do want to maybe conclude our conversation, even though there's obviously so much more we could talk about, by introducing what I'm calling the hermeneutics of suspicion of Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, and how they relate to the worldview problem. Let's talk briefly about Freud's essay on the Weltanschauung,
Yeah.
which is obviously a critical essay
Yeah.
against the concept of Weltanschauung.
Yes.
Lacan will later, and peppered throughout his seminars, he's always making critical jabs at this idea that psychoanalysis does not emerge from a Weltanschauung. I mean, for example, if it did, that would almost like spell the parochialism of psychoanalysis. Because if it was a Weltanschauung, then you could sort of say, well, the basis of its truths are kind of caught within the Victorian bourgeois framework, and like therefore it doesn't have any relevance to us today. And incidentally, that's kind of what Foucault says about psychoanalysis in his history of sexuality in a certain way. So there's that issue. But let's develop a kind of itinerary of what Freud says against the Weltanschauung. Right? I've already indicated one, which is this idea of like, well, its need for totality conceals a suppressed wish for a blissful fantasy immersion back into the oneness of infantile dependency with the mother, right? And therefore this whole construct is actually problematic for the cause of reason. So there's like a weird, like, Hegel comes back in Freud's a certain way, right? This, in other words, well, the whole debate between Kant and Freud comes back in a way. And I would say that Freud falls more on the line of like a Hegelian, or Kant and Hegel. He falls more on the line with a Hegelian reason point, which is that maybe you could say the whole presumption of the worldview is sort of stunting reason, right?
Yes, I think in the essay he has this kind of framing of like the religious period, a period of relativism, of like more modern times, and then like modern forms of religious thinking as being a part of socialism, and kind of this re-emergent I guess movement to master. He says that religion is the attempt to master the sensory world by means of the wishful world, and I think he thinks like the promises of like these stronger forms of socialism, of like worldview socialism, I think is this like idea of the redemption of humanity, and the idea. I think Lukács is especially romantic as far as being a Marxist. This idea that like the total personality will like, that the proletariat must like will redeem humanity as like from like this like kind of degraded, demoralized creature that has everything taken from them to like everything coming back in splendor in a certain way. And so Freud is like, I think he says that he says a few things in here, but he says like, there's like the movement from animism to religion. And I think in religion is when there's certain ethical requirements to be integrated into a family structure. So I think he's like thinking about the beginnings of family structures and how protection depends on fulfilling certain ethical requirements in a family. And then as religion kind of becomes more difficult to hold on to as history continues and people just experience all of these different things, the explanations of religion start to kind of lose their strength. And Freud wants to somehow figure out how to maintain those ethical requirements that were kind of inside of the religious worldview. And I think that it becomes, I guess, kind of what, I don't know how he's necessarily thinking about, like, because he thinks that like civilization, kind of culture, is related to these ethical requirements that kind of spontaneously emerge during the religious period. And he thinks that they continue to be necessary regardless if the religious explanations still hold.
Right.
Yes.
No, that's really good. It's I mean, it's tricky, right? Because there's a certain subtlety here whereby it's similar to what we said about how Hegel deals with the worldview as almost like not some static or sort of like homogenized or sort of pre-existent sort of sphere of aesthetic truths in all of their plurality, but rather Freud, and this is where he's like suspicious. The hermeneutics of suspicion, I think, is useful from Ricoeur. He's wanting to say that the almost like the impetus or the desire for conceiving of a worldview on behalf of the human sort of has to be understood from the position of the unconscious wish fulfillment involved with the gesture to concretize my sensibility in a worldview to begin with. So in that sense, he's sort of subtracting the human from immersion into worldview. And that's a very interesting like gesture in its own way. It's like scissional almost. It's almost like it's why I think in Philip Rief's Freud, the Mind of the Moralist, Rief says a beautiful phrase at some point where he says, look, people often forget that psychoanalysis is actually about courage, because psychoanalysis follows in the wake of Nietzsche. And Nietzsche put forward the proposition that the cosmos is fundamentally meaningless. And therefore, human existence is actually about coming to develop the wherewithal to live with meaninglessness. Therefore, when one has done psychoanalysis, one can live without worldview.
Yes. So I think.
Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. I think Lukács thinks there's meaning in history. He thinks there's a capital R reason in history, and I think, I'm sorry to be hard on him like that. And we can fight about this forever, but certainly in history and class consciousness, the romanticism there, I think, is related to this idea of meaning in history. And the question is like, is this an enduring element of Marxism? I think that's Jameson's question about framing history from necessity to freedom. And but I think like within Freud's point here is like, I think he's extremely skeptical that there can be like a fully conscious humanity that can construct its existence to be utopian. And I think this idea can in some ways be seen in the earlier Lukács, that like that humans are the measure of all things. But I think one way Freud kind of displaces the human in this way is he says that that civilization has like basically like, how does he put it? Like we have like this we have an inherent tendency towards aggression, that these ethical demands kind of displace these they displace these like qualities that can't be dominated in human nature, like kind of these like eternal qualities of human nature, and that these ethical demands, the demands of civilization, of just like economic necessity, kind of displace these like worse instinctual aims, and that we shouldn't alter things, or these displaced instincts will get out of control and will be misdirected.
Right.
And this, so he has this interesting idea that, like, you know, humans can't control themselves, I guess. They shouldn't create their own laws for themselves, I guess.
Well, I think this is really good because there's also the sense in which immersion into like what Freud in group psychology calls like the artificial groups, like the church, the army, for example, inducts you into an aggressive worldview, which your drives will be set off in an irrationalist manner, and psychoanalytic method, like the method to address the irrationalism of bourgeois society, because we should say that Freud does have a theory of the social being that determines immersion into various Weltanschauungs, right? But that our immersion into these artificial groups produces a dissatisfaction for which we need a cure, like the psychoanalytic method, to help ground our drives, or like control or sort of master, which these institutions don't have a solution to that. So there's like a crisis of worldviews in modernity, according to Freud, and it is made apparent by these kind of forms of dependency that produce bad repetitions, that create dissatisfaction, and that force a kind of discontent. Okay. And even though he doesn't have a political practice of a solution to that, the closest he can get is sort of like the reintroduction of these ethical, what you're calling interdictions. But it's sort of a slightly contradictory proposal on Freud's part. And if you were to take a Marxist critique of Freud, I think you could say, well, Freud opens problems that only Marxism can solve, which he gives us further proof that the institutional bedrock of bourgeois society creates subjective misery, which has to be dealt with, right? And it cannot be dealt with on its own terms, right? There needs to be a revolutionary treatment that would be beyond just the cure in some isolated, bourgeois form only for rich people, right? Psychoanalysis, therefore, has to be radically democratized, made more egalitarian, in order for the discontent of civilization to be addressed. The preconditions for that would be a socialist society. That would be my reading of it.
Yeah, I think Freud, disagrees with Marxism for a few reasons. I think one of them was like that strong form of meaning that I was talking about earlier, like that there's meaning in history, and so I think that he would probably think that's related to some sort of like deep instinctual wishes, or he would say it's like trying to make the world correspond to our desires rather than adapting to external reality. But I think he disagrees with Marxism for other reasons. Like, he just kind of flat out, this isn't a long essay by Freud, and he just kind of flat out disagrees that economics, or like a mode of production, is determinate in a strong way that a Marxist would, tend to agree with. He thinks that you can't, that he thinks that, like, and we haven't even gotten into, why that might be the case, that a mode of production would be able to, like, explain a lot of things. But he's basically of the opinion that the economic factor isn't as important, that there are like cultural phenomena. There's like the superego. There's these other, that he disagrees that, like, maybe, like, well, he disagrees with, like, what did I write down here? So he disagrees with, like, the history being the history of class struggles. He disagrees with, like, the view of history, basically. He thinks that he has his own way of thinking about domination in society. He thinks that maybe that what technology really does, he has this bizarre explanation of World War I, where he thinks that basically, like, the invention of planes is, like, the most strongly causal factor for World War I occurring, because any new technology immediately gets put in the service of human instincts for aggression. And so, like, a Marxist explanation of, like, imperialism and, like, the intensity of, like, competition in that way is just, like, he's just not even interested.
Well, this is an interesting point, because I think that it's a form of capitalism, which I've thought a lot about this and I've written about this. I think it's a form of kind of like aristocratic liberalism that Freud is valorizing, because I think that he's afraid of a few different dynamics. On the one hand, he's afraid that the forces of the left could undermine the minimal paternal stability that makes interdictions possible, and therefore makes some minimal stabilization of the system of human aggression at a kind of equilibrium or close to. And that's why he valorizes some forms of capitalist competition, which he sees as reflective of or in the service of inadequate fulfillment of and that's why, for example, he has a whole theory of sublimation. So sublimation becomes, at a social political level, the concept that allows Freud to think like an adequate remediation, let's say, of the irrational drives. Because I think that, yeah, Freud's liberalism is apparent. I think that, at the same time, he's also functioning in Red Vienna. So we say Freud's liberalism, it's a bit of a misnomer, given that historically there's a blind spot and a forgetting of 1917 that colors everything. And there's also the reason for that forgetting, I think, as Balibar has shown, and we can never underestimate Freud's persecuted Jewish status, meaning that Freud didn't take Marxism and communism seriously because the liberal bourgeoisie had at the time pumped the idea that it was a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. Concurrent to the fact that Freud is trying to legitimize his practice as a science. So you see the dynamic there, right? So it gives a skewed, highly historicized and parochial treatment of the problem of socialism and communism. So
we shouldn't. I think we could have historicized each of the texts that we treated in a better fashion. I think there are ambivalences in the Freud piece about, like, he kind of ends it with saying, like, well, maybe if technology keeps developing, that like socialism actually is realizable. And it's like, okay. And I don't know like what his basis for that is. Like maybe like technology, he doesn't think like technology is sufficient to like satisfy those deep instinctual demands of humans. And that the attempt to like think that you could satisfy those demands completely would lead to chaos. And what I also wanted to say is like, you know, I think you can say that, and he thinks Bolshevism is a religion. You know, they start prohibiting things. They're yes, and so it's like, you know, with Lukács, it's like if you think even minimally that there's reason in history, that there's a meaning to history, I guess that does sound like a worldview in the sense of Dilthey, you know? Like it's an interpretation. That's like an interpretive, that's not an explanatory claim. That's like an interpretive claim about the world. And I feel like Lukács isn't scared of having explanations and interpretations. But I feel like it does kind of come down to this idea of like, is Marxism teleological? You know, like, and those are some of the weaker probably points about Marxism. Is it a science? Does it have a science of history? Is it a science of economics? Or is it something way more than that, that has like, it sees meaning in the historical process? It has a tendency towards perceiving history teleologically. And I think these developmentalist ideas that are like teleological, that are associated with Marxism, Freud is skeptical of as well. And so I think, you know, this debate about, which I think Lukács kind of sidesteps, or maybe doesn't realize that he's like involved in the problematic, is like, he is developing worldview Marxism. It's not necessarily a science that stands outside the movement of history and its meanings in a certain way. And I think these debates are extremely fascinating with like the Althusserians. And I think I think they see Freud in some way as kind of like someone in their tradition in a certain way. People can read Freud teleologically as well. But anyway.
Yeah, people can read Nietzsche teleologically as well, insofar as the Nietzschean prophecy becomes a set of confirmations that his late work opens in the sense of the theory of like the last man, and there's like a whole it's sort of like an inverted teleology unto itself. Like this is, somebody makes this argument recently, Dmitry Safronov makes this argument, and I think that teleology is very interesting, because there's a certain sense in which teleology refers to a sense of human purpose and agency, kind of taken us all the way back to the third critique, and this question of right, the how do we come to know the status of man, and so on and so on. Well, Lukács gives an answer in his late work that it is through what he calls the teleological positing of labor that becomes the sort of ontological, social ontological ground where teleology is in fact realized. And this is what makes man man. This is what makes the human human, is this unique capacity for positing our own construction for how the labor process is to proceed, and so on. Now that's very different than the quasi-theological historicist teleology, which would say that abstract historical forces are ushering in a new age in which the kingdom of heaven will be realized, and so on, right? This kind of I don't know, depersonalized, kind of almost like spiritualized form of historical realization, which is that's not really what's present in Engels, for example, in Anti-Düring. That's not, I think, how to understand. But one can see one can see how many people would interpret it that way,
Yeah.
in a certain way, because I do think that a lot of interesting things happen, right? Like, once Engels dies, for example, a lot of the questions regarding science are highly well, like they're thrown into the maelstrom of like the debates, say in the United States context, over like pragmatism. So it's not so much like, do we accept some sort of like, what of the checklist of Marxist scientific discoveries from Capital, the question would become, do we have a convincing enough repertoire of, is Capital, does it constitute the final death blow for a social epistemological argument that capitalism as a that we as the proletariat must overthrow capitalism? Like, in other words, like, there's almost like a kind of logical necessity that the science of Marxism must lead to a certain form of practice, and that if you don't produce that form of practice, then you've somehow deviated from Marxism. And that's where the method thing comes in. In Lukács's essay in History and Class Consciousness on method, I think, is that. But he's only able to write that because he's writing in retrospect after a bunch of stuff happened at the highest point of maturity of struggle against capitalism that we've ever known. That's why I think the text has such a timeless quality. Because, like, in reality, where we're at now, we're really at a more virginal place. Like, it's very weird, like the temporality of that. The temporality of that is like he's so much farther down the line, and we're now like back to ground zero. Like, that's why Badiou in his late work is always saying, like, no, let's not pretend we're in post 1917. Let's more realistically ground ourselves in like pre 1848. We start at the beginning again, kind of thing. This is an asynchronous thing, you know. Anyways, we should probably close, and just want to thank everybody for listening to this open forum brainstorm discussion. I don't know what you would call this, but I really benefited from it, and just wanted to thank you, Mathilde, for your remarks and for your insights here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
It was really enjoyable. I hope others. We'll put our bibliography in the chat, and if you are on Patreon, you can get access to our notes, which I think we'll gladly share for those of you that want to continue research in this area. I think that would be our main, like, if something positive would come from this, that would be a good sign of it for me, is if people join us in this research. And you can join the Discord to chat with us if you wish as well. Thanks, everyone.